Today we are going to talk about Shakespeare's history plays. When we talk about Shakespeare's history plays, we can consider his Roman plays as well. But today I am limiting my talk to the English history plays that Shakespeare wrote. Shakespeare, in his long career as a writer, has written 10 English history plays, 10 plays based on English kings. So why did Shakespeare write these plays? Shakespeare wrote these plays not out of a great patriotic feeling, perhaps, but because he wanted to have drama that people would watch and would bring money. And at that time, the sense of patriotism, Elizabeth's reign, the sense of patriotism ran very high, and you have a whole array of plays written by William Shakespeare on British kings and queens, and not queens, but kings, all of them, 10 of them. So let's look at the 10 history plays of Shakespeare. You can categorize them into 3. 1 in the beginning, then a set of 4, then a set of 4, and 1 in the end. The first history play, not the first that Shakespeare wrote, but if you look at the plays chronologically, from the king who came the first and king who came afterwards and to the last king covered by Shakespeare, we will say that the first king Shakespeare wrote about is King John. King John is very famous. As a young man, people mocked him as John Lackland because his papa did not leave him much land. His brother Richard, whom we remember as Richard the Lionheart, stole the thunder, and he was all important to his father and to the land. But unfortunately, Richard was away in the Crusades most of the time, and the rule was mostly done by the inefficient King John. And we know how the people, his barons, forced him to sign the Magna Carta later on, and you have him establishing that very famous document, which became a kind of milestone in the subjects as varied as political science and history. So King John is the first history play that Shakespeare wrote. Perhaps Shakespeare wrote it earlier in his career, and it is not today remembered a lot, but it still is important as it begins some of the themes that recurrently occur in Shakespeare's history plays. I would say there are 2 major themes in Shakespeare's history plays. One is a sense of patriotism, feeling that England is a great country, a great nation, destined to rule the world perhaps, and destined to be invincible. So that is one theme, the patriotic kind of feelings that is expressed by the different characters in the plays is very, very important. Again, it's something that was very appealing in those days. When Elizabeth wanted to cash in on the patriotic feeling of the people, she promoted that a lot. So Shakespeare wrote many wonderful lines, and the thing is, Shakespeare was a man of multiple talents, and even though these plays were written to cater to the times, we remember many of the wonderful lines that Shakespeare wrote, which are documented in these history plays. So King John is the first play, and then we have a last play I would look at, the very last that Shakespeare wrote of the history series, and also chronologically the last would be Henry VIII, which again is an eminently kind of not much remembered, but still it has some importance both historically and in the literary area. That's again another standalone play. You have John in the beginning, you have King Henry VIII in the end, both standalone plays. In between you have 8 plays which can be divided into 2 sets. The first set is called the Henriad. It traces the life and times of Henry V. Though the first play is titled Richard II, it also kind of adumbrates the beginnings of Henry V, who later on became a kind of legendary king in England, though he ruled only for a short period. So the first play in the second set would be the first set, after King John, would be Richard II. Richard II, the ruler, is the son of the famous prince who passed away before he became a king, called the Black Prince. Edward the Black Prince was the son of Edward III, another huge figure among the monarchs in English history. Edward III had 3 children. One was Edward the Black Prince, second was John of Gaunt, who was the Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of Lancaster, and Edmund, who was the Duke of York. You have 3 children of Edward III, the Black Prince, who died young, and second was Duke of Gloucester. His name is Duke of Lancaster, name is John of Gaunt, and the third is Edmund, Duke of York. So you have 2 families, York and Lancaster there, and a young man who died before he became the king. When King Edward III of England died, his son Black Prince should have been the king, but Black Prince was dead already. He died after a very adventurous career, a short adventurous career as a very brave prince. And his son Richard became the king, and he came to be known as Richard II. And Richard II was not a very efficient king. He made enemies very quickly, and he did a very unwise thing. He kind of sent away from England. He exiled his cousin. His name was Henry Bolingbroke, a young, very active cousin he had, a very warlike cousin. He sent him away to France. He exiled him from England. And later on, when his cousin Henry was the son of the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt. So you have the famous speech of Gaunt in this particular play, which talks about England as a precious stone set in the silver sea. Perhaps the most famous lines about the glory of England that you find in the whole of English literature would be the words spoken by John of Gaunt in Richard II. Richard II, initially in the first early part of the play, we find Richard as the king, but soon you find Henry Bolingbroke coming to England with a little army, taking over control of the country, and he has Richard II imprisoned, and finally Richard II is killed. We do not know whether the orders were directly given by Henry, but anyway, Richard is no more. And Henry becomes the ruler of England as Henry IV. So you have Richard II, towards the end of it, we have a new king other than Richard II being involved in the play, and that is Henry IV. And Henry IV is now a popular king, and towards the end of the play, he is heard talking about his young son, who seems to take things very lightly, fooling around the taverns and having a very fat friend. And this continues in the next 2 plays, Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2. You have mostly the adventures of Prince Hal as a young, irresponsible young man who fools around a lot, who goes robbing people along with his very fat and corpulent friend Falstaff. Falstaff, incidentally, is one of the most humorous characters you would find. A very witty person, very humorous, and whom you cannot defeat in wit. So you have Falstaff as a looming character, a comic character in the 2 plays, Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2. So Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2 follows Richard II, and these 3 form the first 3 plays of what we call the Henriad, the first set of 4 plays, which is followed by Henry V as such. In Henry IV Part 2, we find the king dying, Henry IV dying, and his son becoming the ruler. And once Henry IV, Prince Hal, becomes the king, he leaves his former ways, and he says that he disowns his old friend Falstaff. He says, "I know thee not, old man, fall to thy prayers," and he dismisses Falstaff from his company, and he turns a new leaf, and he proves that he really has the mettle to be a good king in him in the next play, which is Henry V. In Henry V, we find Henry to be a very clever administrator, efficient military general. He wins the battle in Agincourt, which again is another very momentous part in Shakespearean history plays, where he encourages his men once more unto the breach. He commands his people, and they win a victory against very great odds. You have Henry V play, which is often prescribed for study in colleges and universities, and which documents the short life of Henry V. Unfortunately, Henry V died quite young before he saw his middle ages, and he did not rule for long. the one theme of another theme of Shakespeare's plays, other than patriotism, is the fact that is the legend that the king is anointed by God, and he cannot be supplanted. And if somebody supplants a king, commits regicide, it's a very bad thing to do, and punishment is sure to happen, not only to him but to his generations as well. Henry IV has committed this crime of regicide when he had Richard II directly or indirectly killed. So Henry throughout his career, Henry IV throughout his career was worried about his act of regicide. But perhaps Shakespeare is trying to suggest that Henry V dies young because of his father's crimes, and he also suggests that in the coming 4 plays, which are Henry VI part 1, 2 and 3, and Richard III, which forms the 4th of the second 4 plays, the tetralogy, it traces the history of the Wars of the Roses in England. The families of Lancaster and York were fighting, having civil war over a long period of time, trying to gain control over the English king. Why was this? How could this happen? When Henry V died, he did not leave a grown up heir. His son was still a small child. Henry VI was a very small child, and he became the ruler, and many people came as protector and as people who would support the king, and the country was eventually thrown into a civil strife which went on for several decades. Henry VI grew up, he became king as a very young boy, but he grew up to be a young man and grew up to be a middle-aged man, but he proved to be a very inefficient king, one of the most inefficient kings England has ever seen, because he was basically a poet, not cut out to be a king, and he was also given to psychological imbalance. So he was an utter failure as a king, and naturally civil war and a lot of difficulties were happening in the country during his reign. And in Henry VI part 1 and 2 and 3, you find this country being torn between different factions, and many little battles are fought in different parts of the country, and also England has to fight a battle with France when Joan of Arc figures in these plays as a kind of semi-comic character. The second tetralogy concludes with the play Richard III. Richard III is again another usurping king. Richard was not rightfully in the line to be a king. Richard he was the Duke of Gloucester, and he cunningly gets control of the country, having the legitimate king killed, having the heirs killed. He commits a series of murders. At least Shakespeare's play tells us that he commits at least 11 murders not in the battlefield, including his own nephews and his own very close relatives, including his wife. So he has a series of he's pictured as a very brutal kind of king, Richard III, and he assumes throne when after the Civil War, and he tries to consolidate the kingdom once again. So and you find that throughout these years you have the problem between the two houses of York and Lancaster, and the last Lancastrian king was Henry VI, and now you have Richard. In between there was Edward VI, who was again a Yorkist king. So when Richard III begins, Richard is not king, it is Edward who is the king, and Edward is a son of York. Edward belongs to the family of York, and that play begins with the statement which is oft quoted, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York." Lines are spoken by Richard, who is not yet the king, but we find him scheming and eventually planning, finally gets a legitimate king killed, and he becomes the ruler of England. He is also a son of York because he belongs to the York family. So you have at this point a York family ruling England. But soon he could not hold the land together because his deeds, evil deeds, as Shakespeare gives us to believe. Historians are not very sure whether he was as evil as Shakespeare presented him to be. Anyway, he as a result of the mismanagement and a series of problems in the country at that time, another battle ensued, and an army was led by a young man named Henry Richmond, who fought Richard III, and in the Battle of Bosworth Field, which happened in 1485, Richard II was killed in active fight by Henry Richmond and his people, and Henry became the next ruler. So in the whole history of England, if my memory is right, the only 2 kings were killed in active battle, though many peoples were usurped and killed and all that. 2 kings were killed in the battle, and Richard III was the last king to be killed in live action in the battle. The first king perhaps was, I could be wrong, was Harold, who was killed in 1066 by William I in the Battle of Hastings. So we have here Richard III killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field, and Henry Richmond becoming the ruler of England. So here what happens is, Henry combines both the families of Lancaster and York, because he is himself a Lancastrian, but he is married to a woman, Elizabeth, who belonged to the family of York, and he established a kind of consolidated kind of rule, and it put an end to the Wars of the Roses, and England was once again stable, and that stability continued. That is the interesting thing. So Henry Richmond became known as Henry VII, father of Henry VIII and the grandfather of Elizabeth I, during whose reign Shakespeare was born. So this is in short the 10 plays that Shakespeare wrote on English history, the last being Henry VIII, which again it's believed to have been written along with Fletcher, perhaps another writer, and which was written much later when we compare with the other history plays. So in these history plays, perhaps Shakespeare's one big agenda was to please the audience who would often watch his film, because he filled it with patriotism, and because of his genius as a writer, as a craftsman, he brought in several brilliant lines in these along these plays, which encompass the imagined or real glory of England as a nation. So that would summarize the important plays of Shakespeare. But I'd like to conclude with one more statement, that Shakespeare's plays, history plays, also have in them the idea of the divine right of kingship, also the idea of the great chain of being, which was a strong belief in those days in England, which believed that there was a fixed hierarchy which should not be violated. So you have God and angels in heaven, that's the top, and then you have the earth, and the earth has human beings as the top, and then comes the animal, then come the birds, and then comes the small creatures, insects. Among the human beings, the king is the top, and then you have the nobility, and in the family you have the man as the head. So all these very strictly categorized chain network is there, and it was considered a crime for a person to be vertically mobile, and a nobleman or a man belonging to a lower family cannot be a member of or usurp a higher family and assume that kind of place. So an ordinary person can never usurp and become a king. Only a king's son or a king's very near kin can become a king. So when there is an usurpation, when there is a kind of vertical kind of displacement of a monarch, you have a serious problem. So in Shakespeare's time, when he lived, Elizabeth's time, there was always a fear of a kind of civil war. Elizabeth did not have children, so there was a possibility that a civil war might break out soon after her death. So all these fears of the time, all these anxieties of the time are encompassed in the history plays that Shakespeare wrote. So this in short is a summary of Shakespeare's history plays. They are not to be read as history, they are fictionalized, they encompass what Shakespeare wanted the people to believe at that time. He was kind of reflect the tastes of the time, the views of the time, the politics of the time. So that is in short a short assessment of Shakespeare's plays. I strongly recommend that you read more about these and do further research on it. Thank you.